recording. Sharing screen. Okay. Today we will look at the second main sermon of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. It's actually only 2 chapters, and so not many slides today, but next week we will journey into the parables, the kingdom parables. And there are quite a lot of those, but we will just highlight the principal ideas from each parable. This last sermon of Jesus takes place on the Mount of Olives. Towards the end of Jesus' life, the Mount of Olives becomes really central to his ministry. When he came into Jerusalem on that last entrance, which was known as the triumphal entry, he went through, he descended into Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. And we know that when he went back to heaven, he also ascended from the Mount of Olives. And we have seen in Zechariah the prophecy about God and his kingdom coming on the Mount of Olives in the final analysis. So the Mount of Olives becomes really central to the last events, the life of Christ. Most of the time we think it's the Mount Calvary, which takes a lot of attention, or Golgotha, but actually Olives is really important to this story. If you go to Mount of Olives today, this is the picture you see from the Mount of Olives. It's fairly occupied now. Here is the church that supposedly marks the spot where Jesus may have preached this sermon. It's known as the Church of the Olivet. And here is a Russian or Greek Orthodox church, or some Orthodox church. So there's at least a couple of churches around this little hillside. It's just outside Jerusalem, east of Jerusalem. So let's see what Jesus has to say in this sermon. Now, the sermon began with a public provocation that Jesus did. This is very interesting because Jesus brings his disciples to the temple, and then apparently in the presence of everyone who is there, including some of the Pharisees and scribes who are constantly following Jesus, he tells them, you see this temple, it's going to be destroyed. And of course, to the Jews, this second temple, from the time it was rebuilt and then rebuilt again by Herod, had become central to everything from their identification, self-identification, national identification, their worship, their economy, their struggle against the Romans. And for Jesus to make this statement, it was like picking a fight, literally, with the people. As you can see, this would not have gone down well. Now, the disciples were so disturbed by what Jesus was saying about the destruction of the temple that they thought that would mean the end of the world. And so they came to him and they asked him, so when is that going to happen? So their question was really about the end of the world. Jesus's answer is a little bit more vague and a little bit broader than the question itself. So the first thing he did was to give them a number of what we would call generic signs. And the reason for that is you can sort of see these signs in every generation of human life since then. That's why sometimes people are confused. Is Jesus really coming back or not? These early Christians took these signs so literally that they thought Jesus was coming back in their lifetime. So any event that matched these signs would be seen by them as the end of the world. For example, the first Jewish war, and then again the second Jewish war, and so on. One of the signs, which is repeated in 2 different places in the sermon, is this, that there will be false messiahs. Of course, that also means false prophets. Now, the Greek word for Messiah is Christos, from where we get the word Christ in English. So Jesus Christ is not really a proper name. it means literally Jesus, the Messiah. Okay, so he says, many will come in my name. They will say, I am the Christ. And we've seen even in modern times, there's always people making this claim. There is a prophet right here in Thailand who, during the early 2000s up to about 2010, 2015, caused so much havoc in Adventism. Adventist layman who proclaimed himself to be a prophet, talking about the end of the world. He predicted the 2011 flood that we had in Bangkok, but of course his prediction was only partially right. The city was not destroyed the way he thought it would be, like a Noah kind of flood for Thailand. But we've read about, David Koresh proclaim himself the Christ, and there are a number of these people that have come up not just at the time of Jesus, but on a regular basis throughout Christian history, self-proclaimed messiahs. So Jesus says that's one of the signs. But this is generic because it keeps happening again and again. The other one, of course, that has taken so much attention and is receiving a lot of new attention is nations in conflict. For those of you who may not realize or who may have received the ad from me, I'm doing a webinar on the 25th, 7 o'clock in the morning. That's a Sunday morning, on the end times, focusing on very specific signs that seem most relevant to 2024, not just the 21st century, but this particular year or so. And for the Jews, when they heard that Jesus talked about the destruction of the temple, and then in AD 70, that temple was actually destroyed by the Romans after about 6 years of conflict or war between the Romans and Judah or Judea. To them, that was the end of the world. But then we keep seeing these wars. I was still pastoring Singapore when the first Gulf War started. And people, church members, so is this the end of the world? Is this Armageddon? Christians thought that during the First World War, the Second World War, and every major war. And right now, there are 3 major wars happening around the world, plus some really small ones going on as well. Plus the threat of war from China against Japan, Philippines, and Taiwan. The constant potential of a major war breaking out between India and China, or India and Pakistan and China. The threats in the Middle East and African countries that have changed sides and military coups. The world has never been stable. We have always been fighting, but it seems that the sheer volume of wars since the 20th century has increased tremendously. In fact, almost exponentially. Now, those of us who live in Thailand, we are right next door and not that far away from Bangkok against some major war happening in Myanmar. Just spent some time with some people from Myanmar. The conditions are very dire there for people. Full-blown war syndrome with all of the problems that comes. Hardly any power, any electricity left in the country. Mobile and telephone connections are almost non-existent now. The internet has been well and truly cut off, and people are being displaced by the hundreds of thousands all over from different states. It's a war that is really sad. It's happening on multiple fronts. Of course, the world is paying attention to one particular war, but we just saw the excitement this week when Ukraine decided to invade Russia. A whole big territory within Russia that they have captured. And so this is part of the situation we deal with. Persecution and gospel. If any of you had a chance to watch the Olympics, the opening ceremony of the Olympics was mind-boggling in the negative sense. First of all, it featured something that the IOC says should never be featured in the Olympics, and that is a political ideological view, the pushing of the pride movement, the entire ceremony was about the pride movement. But not just that, there was one particular scene where even the Roman Catholic Church just had enough, the Catholic Church in France, and said, "You're insulting the Da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper." It's simply an amazing piece. And the woke voices on the internet have been trolling anybody who took offense at that. That's your problem. You are not up to date. You're not modern enough, etc., etc. So Christians have had a really bad time at the Olympics. Or one of the surfers from Brazil had an image of Christ on his surfboard, and the IOC asked him to change the board or erase that image. It's been interesting. Okay. But along with the persecution will be this other sign of the gospel going into all the world. You know, the text in verse 14. This gospel shall be preached into all the world. And we have just about reached that stage. The Bible has actually been translated into practically every living language of the world and is being retranslated for a second time in almost all languages. So, of the languages that are registered with the UN, most of them have now been translated. So the gospel, in a way, has gone everywhere in a manner of speaking. But then we have some other signs that are a little bit generic, but also in some ways a little bit more specific. For instance, there's the Daniel sign. Jesus talked about the desolation that will happen to the holy, meaning the temple. And for the first century Christians who were all Jewish, the destruction of that temple by the Roman army was the fulfillment of this Daniel sign. But Daniel's sign is also generic because it describes how one of the things that Satan will do is to attack the holy. And the holy is not just that particular temple, but any place and any people that are part of God's kingdom. So the holy, as in being the kingdom of God. Attacks against Christianity are coming from all over the place right now. You know, from the left philosophy known as woke, from the pride movement, from Islam. Okay, it's happening everywhere. Christians are being killed in large numbers in many countries in Africa, like Nigeria, the Congo, and there is sooner or later some persecution that will arise in India once the BJP has had enough with putting down Islam. They'll probably target Christianity next, if it isn't already happening in some small ways. And so this is going to carry on. These two things, persecution and preaching the gospel. Now, here's the thing about history. Christianity has always thrived best under persecution. Christianity tends to stagnate when there is peace. And so the Daniel sign is more than just the destruction of that temple by the Roman army, but it's the cycle of Satan working against God's kingdom. So the holy could refer also to the people of God, because the Hebrew terminology in Daniel 9 simply says the holy. It doesn't give us a qualifier. The holy place, the holy people, the holy God probably means all of those things. And then, of course, those supernatural signs. I don't know if any of you actually bothered to stay up this week and watch the meteor shower. There's some magnificent or some awesome pictures on the BBC website about the showers. You know, when a major shower hit the Western Hemisphere in the 19th century, people got so excited that this was the end of the world. But science is telling us that we're going to be hit by more and more meteorite showers, as we get deeper into this universe that seems to be in trouble, as well as the planet. And so this is not a surprising thing. Meteorite showers have been recorded fairly consistently. Scientists can even predict when the next one might be, and so on. But then there's a special sign Jesus gave called the fig tree sign. He says, when you see certain things happening on the tree, the fig tree, you know summer is coming. And it's the same way with his coming. Now, Jesus would say in this sermon that the actual time of his coming will not be known. Hi, welcome, Sanki. Sanki, I just saw you. However, the signs will be there. And if you're not watching, you'll miss. It's kind of like driving down the road. There are road signs and you're looking for a particular soy, but at a certain moment in time, you get distracted or in a conversation or the phone is ringing or whatever, and you miss that particular sign and you drive past and you say, hey, wait a minute, I've passed the street, the soy that I need to enter. This is the hassle of modern day driving, despite having GPS. And GPS will warn us in 1 kilometer, in 300 meters, and so on and so forth. Turn left, turn right. I went to Pattaya about a week ago to visit some friends, and there's a new highway that has just opened. It's an extension of the motorway, but not into Pattaya. That was already done a few years ago. But this extension takes you directly to Chamtian. In the past, you had to go into Pattaya and then drive through Highway 3 towards Chamtian. Now you can go directly. But the highway is so new that there was hardly any traffic in it, both going in and coming out. It was so nice to drive for several kilometers, actually quite a long stretch with hardly any other cars around you. You can just cruise. But if you are not paying attention to the signs, you'll miss. There is a new exit from Highway 1 into the motorway when you're coming down from Nakhon Ratchasima, Mokleg, coming back into Bangkok. It's a new one. It also connects to the new motorway 6 that will run from Ayutthaya to Korat. I almost missed the entry because it was not at the place in much earlier than the old entry, and I'm like, is this correct? But yes, the sign was there. The signs are quite big. Bangkok, Suvarnabhumi. Just follow it. And my car GPS actually got lost because it's not in the software. It's just open. It was so much fun leaving that car GPS on just to see how GPS can get lost. Okay. Of course, with the mobile phone, which updates your GPS constantly, then that doesn't happen. It will show you exactly where to turn. Even then, there's just one exit ramp. And so if you're not careful, you might still miss it. Jesus says, if you know how to read the fig tree and therefore know the season that's coming, this is much more important. And then the final sign is the Noah sign. Whatever happened in the days of Noah will happen again before Jesus comes. Now, I'm not going to touch much on the Noah sign today because this is a major part of my presentation on August 25 for the webinar. So if you're really interested in the details of the Noah sign, then maybe you might want to wake up for that particular seminar. But the words of Jesus is very cryptic. As it was in the days of Noah, that's how it will be when the Son of Man returns. And so in that webinar, I'm going to pry open this Noah sign and what it really means and why we are living in a time that is the only time in 2000 years of Christian history where that is actually happening. All right, so this is commercial time. But commercial aside, the final part of this sermon is of chapter 24, the first part of the sermon is about the faithful servant. Jesus says the faithful servant knows two things. One is that there is no confirmed, precise date for the return of the master. And so what do? You keep things ready. You stay on guard, you stay alert. The words in most English translation is keep watch and be ready. But keep watch there doesn't mean that you're just sitting and looking at the signs. That some people are doing that. No, keep watch means that you stay alert. You pay attention to what's happening around you. You read the news. You know what's going on in the world. There's nothing worse than a Christian living just before Jesus comes who knows nothing about what's happening in the world around you. The war in Israel right now is fulfilling a prophecy. It's not just any war. It's not just another war between Palestinians and Israel. The way the kingdoms of the world, so to speak, the nations of the world are aligning themselves in this war is fulfilling some major, major prophecies that have never shown their faces until now. And so we can't take this as just another war. This is somehow feeding into the end times in a way that we have not seen. Yes, there have been wars between Israel and the Arabs several times since their independence, but not like this, not with the kind of backing that the Palestinians are receiving, which is all portrayed. The earliest prophecy about this war actually happened at the time of Moses by Balaam the prophet, who prophesied, looking down through history, that Israel will have to stand all alone among the nations. Okay. And so the faithful servant knows this. You cannot expect help from governments. If you live in Thailand, governments are changing every few months. The previous prime minister pushed this idea, the digital wallet idea, where certain people would receive free money, 10,000 baht. And this new government that was just elected today has already said that probably they will not follow through on that digital wallet idea. Governments change so quickly. America is headed for another election. Who knows who will win and what policies will come because of that? When the Ukraine war first started, Europe, NATO, and America that supplied weapons to Ukraine said that you cannot use our weapons to attack Russia. You can only use to defend yourself. But this week, actually last Saturday, Ukraine attacked Russia. They went into the Kursk region. Okay, and right now, a major chunk of that region is under Ukraine control, and they're using the same weapons that a few months ago they were told you cannot use against Russia directly, only to defend yourself. Now they're using it in an offensive way. And so we need to see what's happening in the world. Population groups are collapsing. It is predicted by the end of this century, the population of China will fall in half. It will be half of what it is now because of the policies of the past, the huge Chinese immigration. And some new data has arisen that the largest number of people trying to get in illegally into the US through the southern border are not the Latinos anymore, it's the Chinese. That the Chinese illegal immigrants have overtaken the Latinos trying to get through that southern border into the US. Something is happening in the country. The economy is not as great as people would like to think. The pandemic has really changed the world in many ways. We're pretending it hasn't, like we're back to normal. But right now, the WHO has put an alert against this new strain of the Mpox virus. Right now, the danger seems to be only in Africa, but who knows? Okay, another pandemic. So the faithful servant is alert. He keeps track. He knows all these things that are happening. Now, being a Christian in the 21st century, as we see more Bible prophecies, more, and by more, I mean sheer volume of prophecies that are being fulfilled right before our eyes, we should be the most alert generation of Christians. My fear is that Adventists have become so accustomed to hearing about the end times. Jesus is coming back. This is the end of the world. Armageddon is going to happen, that we have become almost unfeeling about it. No more that sense of excitement or the sense of danger that previous generations of Adventists would have. Something to really consider. Are we a people like Isaiah predicted, who will see but not, who will look but not see, who will hear but not listen? That prophecy will fulfill right before our eyes, and then we wonder what just happened. And so this sermon is very disturbing sermon, because in the sermon Jesus also talks about how people will grow cold, their ability to love. We have reached a point in human history where the dominant philosophy, by that we mean ethical philosophy, is this: whatever I feel is right, that is right. Doesn't matter what anyone else says or what any authority says or what anybody else feels. We have reached a very dangerous point of history. Those of you who are teaching in schools right now, you're teaching this generation who are growing up with this ethical philosophy. They're known as the Generation Z or Gen Zs in the American lingo. Almost all Gen Zs, every research is producing the same results. Almost all Gen Zs live by this ethical norm. If I feel it's right, it's right. Doesn't matter what anyone else says. And so the faithful servant is living with eyes and ears wide open. Okay. I seriously suggest that you and I, as believers in this particular point in history, we need to really keep up with the news. Our Bible study should not just be the text, but understand the text in its context. By that, I mean historical context. The early Christians saw those signs happening in their world, and they thought Jesus would come back in their time. Now, we are seeing a magnification of those signs in our world. So how much more sensitive should we become to what's really happening in the world? All right, as we get into the next part of the sermon, Jesus gives us some more signs. The persecution and global gospel phenomenon, let's talk about it a little bit more. This gospel shall be preached to all the world. Now, clearly, there are places where the gospel has not been preached yet, and therefore, this may delay the return of Christ. Persecution is fairly rife now. You cannot, even in Christian countries, supposedly Christian countries, which were the homelands of the missionary movement, Australia, Germany, the UK, England, and the US. It's very tricky. The term in Europe now is not about Christianity in the UK, but the Islamization of the UK. So much so that when you look at the two UN bodies that govern world policies, the ICJ and the ICC, ICC has a British Muslim as the main prosecutor. ICJ is a Lebanese Muslim who is the head of the ICJ. And it's amazing that these countries, the ICJ has three judges who come from countries that are a total mess or total dictatorships. Same thing with the ICC. It is not the Western liberal democracy that's ruling the world. Okay. Being a Christian is going to become harder, not because of the outright persecutions like the Romans did. These days, it will be much more subtle. And I think that the online issues will matter a whole lot more as we go along. A little more about the Daniel sign, the sacrilegious. This translation by the NLT is very interesting. The sacrilegious object that causes desecration standing in the holy place. Now they've added the word place, which doesn't really exist in the original text, just says in the holy. And I'm suggesting that from a physical point of view, the holy place would be the Temple Mount. And you know the problem of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. You know the havoc that was caused this week when one of the right wing ministers of the Israeli government, led a prayer in the Temple Mount. Now, think about the anomaly. The Temple Mount is the holiest site of Judaism since the time that that Solomon built the temple on that site. And yet the Jews are not allowed to pray there because there's another religion, Islam, that occupies the temple site. And when this minister, Ben Gvir, led a group of Jews to pray on that, there was such an uproar all around the world about how you are, you're causing all kinds of problems and so on and so forth. What would happen if Christians were to go up on that Temple Mount and also pray, because Jesus had prayed on that Temple Mount centuries before Muhammad supposedly visited that Temple Mount? What do you think will happen around the world to Christians who would dare to do that? And by the way, there is a Christian movement that has been preparing for years to build the third temple. And their aim, and it's the state of Israel that is stopping them, their aim is to destroy the Dome of the Rock and Al Aqsa Mosque and build a temple on that sacred mount. But you see, any of these acts, no matter who initiates them, is going to desecrate the holy. But think about the holy as the holy people. You know, there are enough prophecies in the Bible that point to the fact that the word will become extinct, that the word of God will remain something in our heads rather than something on paper. The world will turn against it like they did at the French Revolution. It's an amazing piece of understanding history, how these signs actually keep happening. Jesus puts this caution: don't worry too much when you see these signs happening. They will happen, but it's not necessarily the end. There's more pain coming. Supernatural phenomena. Now, when Adventists read this, they pay attention to the darkened skies, the falling stars, etc. But I believe that the most important part of this structural or supernatural phenomena is this: that God will gather his chosen ones, his people, from all over the world. That this is a time of gathering. That all those who are truly belonging to the kingdom of God, which Matthew is preaching here in his gospel, they will be gathered together in one place. That's why there are these two battles in the book of Revelation that marks the end of time. Armageddon, where everyone will gather apparently somewhere, and then Gog and Magog, where everyone will gather around the New Jerusalem. The righteous inside, the wicked outside. So we will see a microcosm, if you like. I believe now that Armageddon is a microcosm of that final battle for the New Jerusalem. Now, Jesus doesn't say where he will gather them, but the assumption, because of the connection with the Daniel sign, is that he will gather them to the holy place. I've written an essay to explain from a biblical perspective why all the focus of the Bible is on one piece of land, a rather small piece of land. Why every empire of the world has focus on that piece of land. Because I believe that the holy place is the original home of the garden that God gave Adam and Eve. And so the gathering of his people will be to gather them back to that place. By the way, the place of the original Garden of Eden is probably much bigger than the modern day land of Israel, as we call it. So we're talking about roughly the Middle East region. But that's just my conjecture about how to read some of these prophecies. With the fig tree sign, even though Jesus, when he said, when you see the leaves, you know summer is coming, he said something else. No one knows the day or the other when these or hour when these things will happen. He says that the angels don't know, that he himself doesn't know, and only God the Father knows that precise moment. And yet, you know what's amazing about Adventist history? Every decade that I have lived as an Adventist, somebody somewhere in the world has come out saying, Jesus is coming at this time. Jesus is coming at this time. Okay. 1975, when I joined a theology program in Spicer, one of my professors, American missionary, he was so responsible for me becoming an Old Testament scholar. But he believed Jesus would be back in 10 years. In fact, those of us who were doing theology, we felt burdened to try and accelerate our studies that we can, get back into the field, so to speak. One of my English teachers from high school came up with a date in 1987. Well, it didn't happen. She and a group of people actually left their jobs, resigned everything, took their kids from school, established a commune in the mountains somewhere in Maharashtra, I believe, or a little further south. When I went for graduate studies in the Philippines, there was a Bible teacher, theology teacher at Philippine Union College. That's what it was called in those days, who gave the date 1996. And many of the PUC theology graduates dropped out of school because of that teacher saying, what's the point of staying in school? What's the point of a BA if Jesus is coming back on this date? Now, this is amazing. We're supposed to read the fig tree, but not to know the exact date. And I can go on with other examples, but I'm just taking the ones that I've actually literally met. And of course, that high prophet 2011, Jesus was supposed to have come back because of that big flood. None of these things has happened. My college professor has passed away. The other two people I talked about, I think both of them have also passed away. And while this prophet still claims himself to be a prophet, but his movement has basically lost steam. And then something that Jesus said about the Noah sign is really important for us. I'm not talking about the sign so much here because I'll be doing it in that webinar. But there's a statement I need to draw your attention to. He says that when the flood came, people did not realize the flood was starting. Can you imagine? They were so engrossed with their lives, with the materialism of their lives, that when the rain started coming and the ground started breaking open with water, they still didn't realize what Noah had been preaching for about 120 years. And if this could happen to their world, and they were much smarter than we are, it will happen again to our world. We will be so engrossed with sports and the Olympics and pride movement and human rights and wars around the world, mpox and the next pandemic or whatever, that when it actually happens, we will not know it's happening. And so this is a really scary thought that Jesus introduces in this sermon, that the end of the world could be happening and we don't realize it is happening. There's some Adventists who are still gung-ho about Sunday law. They're waiting for some Sunday law to happen. They think when the Sunday law happens, whatever they understand that to be, then they can get ready for the end of the world. Now, number one, there's not going to be a Sunday law. That has always been a part of human history. Number two, if you're waiting for any particular sign that way, you will not realize until the skies open up and you see the glory of Christ up there in the air. By then, it'll be too late. CNN, BBC, nobody can save you. Nobody can forewarn you. There will be no seismological event to warn us a big earthquake is coming. Japan just put the country on a mega earthquake watch this past week. They have lifted the watch, but there were signs that there might be a mega earthquake. Now imagine what a mega earthquake will do to Japan. We know what it did the last time there was a major earthquake. And climatologists are telling us that the world is headed for a mega earthquake. Just one of the things that's about to happen. So even science, while rejecting the teachings and the prophecies of the Bible, is actually proving those same prophecies real, particularly the ones dealing with natural phenomena. We are seeing things happen. I met a couple at the Indian church last month who had just come out of Dubai. Imagine Dubai in the middle of the desert, so to speak, had the worst floods they've ever seen in their history. In fact, they've never had floods. How can desert have floods while it's roasting in some parts of the United States? It's like the climate itself has gone reversed. The latest studies of the Earth tell us that the core of the Earth has basically stopped spinning. That's why we're seeing all these crazy weather patterns happening, because when the core of the Earth stops spinning, the electromagnetic fields around the Earth that actually protect it and guard it and keep it safe, they are going to change. And the latest science says is that there's a reason it's stopping, because it looks like it's about to reverse motion. Do you know what that would mean? To the oceans, to the tectonic plates, to the weather patterns. So what we are seeing is, now I've never been a person who gets excited and talks a lot about these, but I've been spending so much time looking at these prophecies and looking at climate science and historical events happening before our eyes, and I've never seen this volume of prophecies literally walking before us. And yet we are still so engrossed with day-to-day living that we do not realize. So the warning of the Noah sign is, you will not realize. Only the faithful servant who is alert and keeps watch will realize when it's happening. So the command for the faithful servant is keep watch and be ready, be alert. Imagine that it can happen right now. Live as if it is happening at this moment with that sense of alertness, so it does not catch us unawares. In fact, Jesus makes a comparison that his coming will be like a thief breaking into your house. It's kind of a scary thought. If we could predict when a thief can break into somebody's house, or we would know how to guard ourselves. Okay. So these days, people are much more alert, secular people, about thieves breaking into their houses. So they have CCTV cameras, motion sensors, motion lights. I go for a walk very early in the morning, and there are several houses in my Muba, and as I walk by, the light comes on. It detects my presence, and the light comes on. And I'm not even near their gate. I'm actually on the road. Many houses have cameras, just in case something happens, you can see who's coming in and whatever. Now, what Jesus is saying is that his faithful servants need spiritual CCTV cameras. They need spiritual motion sensors that will alert them this is happening, and not be like Noah's world that do not realize what is happening. Okay, the last part of the sermon is actually the interesting one, because it involves not parables. These are not actually parables. They are more like comparisons that Jesus is making. And there are three of them. The first two could be treated as parables, and you can treat them as parables, but they're not in the mold of the parables. They don't have the language of the parables. The first one is about the 10 bridesmaids. We all know the story. They waited and waited, and the groom's party did not come by. They fell asleep. After midnight, he comes by, and they wake up, and some are ready to join, some are not ready. They didn't have lamps, and so they got cut out. The point is the same from the ending of chapter 24. They were not alert. They were not watching. And when they wake up, the reason they could not join is because they did not have oil. They had lamps, and that was the interesting thing. They had lamps, but they didn't have the oil to fire up their lamps. And so they missed out on the party. When they finally arrived at the door, it was closed and there was no more chance to go in. For a long time, this parable was one of the main biblical texts used by Adventists to prove a close of probation concept. Um, but the concept is far more nuanced than we have preached about it. It's not a specific case in time, because any close of probation takes into account personal time. So if you do not live until that particular moment, so what? Your probation is decided one way or the other, or your salvation is decided one way or the other. The second story or parable is about the three servants. Okay. How much talents they were given. The first two multiplied their talents, doubled up. The other one hid the talent and pretended, I was not trusted enough. And so, I just kept it safe and giving it back. The point that Jesus made in these stories, though, is this: those who use well what they are given, even more will be given to them. And they will have an abundance. But those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. This is not about talents of life. The word talent that is used here is actually a money term. Okay, now we think, yes, it's unfair that the third servant got only one talent. But here's the thing: one talent was equal to a person's earnings for an entire year. So even the man with the one talent got a huge capital to begin life with. In this story, Jesus doesn't spell out expectations from the rich man who gave them these talents, but there were unspoken expectations, because when he came back, he called them to account. Okay. Point here is this: that there are no backbenchers in the kingdom of God. There are only workers. The kingdom of God is made up of worker bees. One of the amazing things, that's why we are told to look at the ants, to look at nature, to learn the lessons. The lesson here is one of diligence. Being alert and watching for the coming doesn't mean that you sit by and pray and fast all the time. That's not the alertness. Many of those people who do a lot of that praying and fasting, they don't have a clue what's happening in the world. They don't understand how AI is changing the world. An IT friend of mine introduced me to an AI website. Well, it's a website where you can create your own songs. And I've been having so much fun. I put in my words and I decide what instruments to use, what music type to use, male voice, female voices, or whatever, and out comes a song. Max and Sanki, when I meet you the end of the month, I'm going to play one of those songs. Is actually good enough for us to use in our team worship. Okay. And it's been amazing. It's not my voice singing, but it's my words, my lyrics, my music choice, and everything else. And the AI puts it all together and produces a piece of music. In fact, they usually produce two different versions every time you ask. This is the world, but this is the world that easily fools us as well. Think about how all this is changing cars, for example. Okay, people have fallen into this fadism about electric vehicles, that somehow they think electric vehicles are the answers to the pollution problems of the earth. But here's some real science. Electric cars, by and large, are much heavier than normal um, combustion engine cars, which means that the brake pads and the tires wear and tear is much higher rate than a normal car. And we don't see it with our eyes, but every time you drive on the road, your rubber is wearing off, and that rubber is wearing off into tiny little particles which then float up in the air and become part of PM 2.5. So they will actually produce and add to the pollution level. Most countries like Thailand, the ports where you can recharge your batteries are run by electricity, but that electricity is being produced by thermal power, usually fossil fuel power, coal or petrol. And the more EVs on the road, the more electricity has to be produced, and so you haven't solved the problem of pollution. But the AI problem is the real thing, the real problem, because the advancement is not year by year or month by month, it's day by day, literally. So if you buy an EV now, in 10 years, it's so out of date that you can never resell it. They already have electric vehicle graveyards in America and Europe because no one will buy. First of all, the battery has worn out. Secondly, it's so out of date technologically in 10 years that you won't buy. You buy an EV today, next year, the EV, same model, same make, BYD, whatever you like, will have advanced so much. It's like our mobile phones. That's why we keep buying new mobile phones because we have no choice. It keeps changing. The technology keeps changing. And so Jesus says that this lazy servant or this third servant, he just simply sat doing nothing, like people who just pray all day and don't know what's happening around the world, don't keep tabs on how prophecies are being literally and physically fulfilled in our world. The last part of the Sermon on the Mount is the judgment part. He says, when the Son of Man returns, there will be just two groups of people. Forget all the permutations we have in our world today. There will be just sheep and goats. And they will be questioned in similar ways. So to the sheep, he will say, when I was hungry, you fed me, when I was thirsty, etc., etc. And they will say, we did not know. When did we do that to you? And then he would say, when you did it to one of the least of my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me. Similar thing to the goats, but with a negative in it. I was hungry, but you did not give me food. I was thirsty, you did not give me water. And they were like, when did we see you hungry or thirsty? If we had seen you, we would have done it. This is typical religious behavior. We would do it if we know about it. You see, Jesus would say to them, depart from me, I don't know you. Because when you refuse to help someone, you are refusing to help me. So what is the judgment? The essence of this judgment. If you look at the first sentence that I have here, is that our humanity is the true measure of our spirituality. God doesn't care how many times we go to church or how much tithe we have given. He only cares how many people we have helped along the way. Because in doing so, we are working the kingdom of God. Whether we realize it or not, whether we care about it or not, whether we are noticed or not. And this synchronizes with what he said in the Sermon on the Mount, that when you help somebody, perform acts of charity, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is. They didn't even know they were serving God. They thought they were just helping humanity around. The other, they claimed they would have served God. So they ignored all the needs of people around them while praying hard for him to come back. This mentality goes all the way back to the 8th century BC, the time of Isaiah, and you can read how it repulses God when we are this way, when we ignore the need of humanity under the guise of spirituality. The last part of this series on Matthew, we will examine Jesus headbutting with the religious establishment. And this is the point. Because the Pharisees and the scribes had developed a religious approach that was so fine-tuned but completely ignored human need. One of their fine-tuning is this. On Sabbath, if one of your animals falls into a pit, it's okay to rescue that animal from that pit. But to heal a man who is sick on the Sabbath, that would be breaking the Sabbath. And so that is what Jesus is talking about. That's the difference between goats and sheep. Sheep have a human base approach to life. There are people around me. People around me need my help. And so I stretch out my hand to help them, not to be recognized, not to be noticed, not to receive awards, but simply to help them. And in the Sermon of the Mount, Jesus had said, what you do in secret, God sees, and he will reward you openly. So the sheep are not known for their religiosity. They are known for their acts of kindness. The goats, oh, they are super religious. They will rescue their donkeys, but not a fellow human being. And so Jesus says there will be only those two kinds of people. And it's amazing where you will find kindness. I was walking from my house to the nearest 7-Eleven, which is about a kilometer away. I needed something. It was a hot afternoon. I had my cap on. And it was around 2:30, so it was really hot. This was a few weeks ago. And the car pulls up next to me, and the driver rolls down the window. It was a lady driving, and she said something in Thai. I couldn't quite understand her, so I asked her, could you speak English? And she could quite fluently. She switched quickly to English and said, do you need a ride? I can take you up to the main road. There's a main road right outside our village, or short distance outside our village. I said, no, sorry, I don't need. I'm just going to the local 7-Eleven. I'm just taking a walk. Now, why would a total stranger out of nowhere, who's probably a Buddhist or maybe just a secular person, stop a woman to offer help to a guy she doesn't know walking in the hot sun? I've encountered those acts of kindness. And you know what? I believe in my heart, those people, whether they ever know about Christ directly or not, and we have studied Zechariah, so you should know the answer, they will be in the kingdom of God. My saddest experience as a pastor happened in Singapore. I was pastoring this church, and there was this Muslim lady from the neighborhood who was extremely poor. I mean, she was really, really poor. Later on, I learned that her husband was a drug addict. He was in prison. Her brother was a drug addict, was in prison. She had several kids, no money. She had no education. And for some strange reason, she thought that this Christian church is the place to go for help. So she came to our church every Sabbath asking for help. And at first, the church helped her. We would give money, some food supplies for the kids, some Pampers, and because we knew she had 1 or 2 babies, and so on and so forth. And she kept coming. So they were like, maybe we need to help her establish some kind of little business that she can make money, stand on her own feet. So they set her up for what is called satay. Satay is, it's a kind of pieces of meat stuck on a piece of wood or metal thing and roasted over some charcoal. It's very easy. I don't know what do they call here. So we tried that, but it didn't work, not in that family background. Then one day the church board took a decision, and no matter how much I argued and debated with them, they took the decision, we cannot help this lady. We should not help this lady anymore. She kept coming to the church for a few more weeks, and eventually she got the message of all the cold shoulders. Okay. And then she disappeared she never came again. And, I was like, now I know that there were individual members in the church who still tried to help her when they could, but that an entire church, as a body, took a decision. We cannot help this human being. She is beyond help. Forget it. Can you imagine Jesus doing something like that? Can you imagine his disgust if he was in that church board? And so it's something for us to think about. God is not going to measure us by how religious we are, but how humane we are. And that is the final piece of sermon that Jesus preached to his disciples. Be a sheep or be a goat. Have you noticed that throughout the Bible, God's people are compared to sheep? And it's only when we get to Matthew 25 that we discover why. Because sheep do things that God expects without knowing they're doing things that God expects, without taking notice, without asking to be noticed, without recognition, without awards, with none of the things we associate with being philanthropic. They're not being philanthropic, they're just being human. Okay. Um, a kid was riding his bicycle and I was working in my front yard. And right in front of my house, his bicycle chain came off and he didn't know how to put it back together, a young school kid. So I stepped out of the gate and put the chain back for him. And he said thank you in Thai. He didn't know much English. And I never saw that kid again in the village. Humaneness is not just about occasional acts of kindness. We all are capable of that. But it's actually about a way of life. We give because God is a giving God. And those are the only kinds of people that he will take into his kingdom. Those who give because they're expecting something, they're waiting to be recognized, those are the gods. And so in this sermon, Jesus is preparing his disciples for the future, for his coming, and for that final act of judgment when he would differentiate between the goats and the sheep. And the only thing for us is, are we goats or are we sheep? There's nothing in between. There's no hybrid in between. The modern world loves this hybrid concept so much, but it will not exist in the kingdom of God. And sheep and goats are not measured by their religiosity, but by their humanity, their humaneness towards other humans. That's what God looks for. The God who came to save the world wants us to save that world without taking credit for it. All right, let me stop the sharing and also stop the recording.